Hello everyone and welcome to the presentation of EagerNet, a new technique for early predictions of neural networks for computationally efficient intrusion detection. My name is Faris Mcdouri and the paper was accepted at the For Cybersecurity Networking conference. So the overview of this presentation: first of all, I will present fully connected neural networks, FCNNs. Then we will talk about backpropagation algorithm and how this is used for training the FCNNs. I will talk also about FCNNs and how we can use them for network traffic analysis and intrusion detection. I will present our proposed algorithm, talk about results, outcomes, and conclusion. So I know that most of you are already familiar with fully connected neural networks, but let's just forget about it for a second and ask ourselves, what if we have a system, or we can build a system that takes numerical vectors and outputs something that we want, or exactly what we want? Well, it turns out that such a system already exists, and it's called logistic regression, or logistic regression units. So those units take many values, multiply them with predefined weights, and sums up the result and pass it through an activation function. Then it gives us a single value. Well, what we can also do, or what researchers already developed, is basically a stack of those units, so a horizontal and vertical stack. And in figure 1 here, we see such an architecture. So we have a stack in both directions, and those circles here are the logistic regression units. And the entire system is called the fully connected neural network. So basically, it takes an input vector here and gives us a prediction, so a set of values or a single value at the end. Now there is the definition of the forward propagation, which is just the way how we get our output here. So basically, just by feeding our numerical vector here into our architecture and then perform all the multiplications and get something at the end, as I explained before. Well, this is quite easy, but actually how do we make the network outputs what we want? So this is what we call learning, actually. And for that, we would need, first of all, data. So if we want to achieve this, we would have to train our network in a supervised manner. And basically by supervised, I mean that we have samples and their labels. So what we do next is just we split the data into two sets. So we have a validation set and a training set. We use, of course, the training set to train the network or make it learn, and then we use the validation set to test if our network, model, or system learned what we wanted to learn. Then, of course, learning means adjusting the weights, so the weights that I talked about before, that are multiplied with the values. By adjusting those weights in such a special way, we can make the network output what we want. So it outputs the label for our sample. Well, adjusting is a simple word, but how do we do it actually? For that, there exists the backpropagation algorithm. So I will explain how the algorithm works in a simplified manner. And first of all, I have to define a loss or an error. And basically what the loss or the error is just how far our output is from the actual output that we want. And for that, we can use some distance metric. There are many metrics that are developed, so the mean square error, maximum likelihood, or cross entropy, etc. But the goal is the same. It just tells us how far we are from the actual output. And then the algorithm works the following way. So we have our input, feed it to the network in the forward pass. We get the output, we compute our loss, and then we use this loss to adjust the weights using the computation graph. So basically we adjust each weight starting from the last layer by a fraction of this loss in a special way. I will not go into details, you can find more details in the paper. And then what we do is just we repeat this procedure for all samples, and of course we can repeat it multiple times for the training set. Now, actually how do we then feed network traffic to such FCNNs? Well, let's consider here the simplest scenario in figure 2. So we have two hosts communicating with each other, sending packets, for example, and what we do is just we summarize the information of this communication in what we call a flow. So we construct a flow that collects meta statistics, and then we consider each flow as a sample. So each flow has values, which is or it is a numerical vector, and it has a label. And in our case, a label would be it's normal traffic or there is something suspicious. So basically it's an attack. And then of course, which values do we put in our flow? Well, here we go to table 1, where I explained what we call the Kaya flow representation. So we have a set of features here. So for example, the duration of the flow or the communication here, source destination transport paths, so TCP, UDP, which protocol is being used, and how many bytes are being transferred. And then there are many features here, and some of them we can even apply on some statistical operations. So basically, if we consider the total length of the packet, then we can also compute the mean, the minimum, maximum standard deviation among all packets that are here transferred. And this way we construct a really large vector with numerical values that can be considered, as I said before, a sample. Now our proposed way, or what we are trying to solve here, is basically when we feed those samples into a simple FCNN, we were wondering, are all layers needed actually to detect attacks? Because we all know that some attacks are really easy to detect, other attacks are hard to detect. So what we do is basically we add a neuron to each layer. So we take a simple feed forward architecture, and then we add a neuron to each layer. And we call this neuron O, which means output. So basically we add an output to each layer, and we would have then many outputs actually at the end. And what we do is during evaluation, we evaluate the prediction of each layer, and then we stop evaluating if the prediction at that layer meets a certain threshold. So if the confidence is high enough, let's say at layer 2 we are 90% confident that this is normal traffic, then we stop there. We don't continue evaluating the entire network. And this way basically we can save resources and without continuing until the last layer. But on the other hand, we should continue until the last layer if the attack that we are trying to detect, or any kind of traffic that we are trying to detect, is complicated enough. Now the problem is then, how do we train this network? Because we said before that we backpropagate the loss from the last layer, and it's really simple. So basically we compute the loss then at each layer. So in figure 4 here, we have a loss at each layer. We have the main loss at the final layer, and then we have a loss at each extra neuron that we added before. And then what we do is just we backpropagate all these losses. So here we start by backpropagating only this loss through these weights, and then here we have a summation of 2 losses that is backpropagated. Here the summation of many losses, and here the summation of all losses that are backpropagated. So this way the network will try to learn all patterns as early as possible. And then what we also did is basically multiply each loss with a weight here, so the W, and this is just to make one layer learns more than the other layer. So we tried a different combination of ways, for example a uniform weighting, or increasing weighting, or decreasing weighting, just to make sure that, for example, the first layer should learn earlier patterns than the last layer. So this is the architecture that we call a EagerNet architecture. Now for the results that we obtained, so basically we performed a comparative study, and the goal here was just to compare our EagerNet architecture to a simple FCNN. And for that we used 2 datasets. One dataset from 2017 and the other one from 2015. Both are intrusion detection datasets, so a set of packets with labels. And we applied it to 2 problems, so a binary classification problem and a multi-class classification problem. For the binary you have either 0 or 1, so it means that it's normal traffic or malicious traffic, and the multi-class is trying to find which actually attack is it. And then we took the prediction accuracy at the last layer, and what we can notice in table 2 is that both architectures, they have almost similar performance. So basically adding neurons and changing the way how the network is trained didn't affect the performance at the last layer. So even with an EagerNet architecture, we can use it as a normal FCNN just by looking at the last layer. So, and this was true for both problems, binary and multiclass, and for both datasets. The next result is we tried to find out how many layers are needed, and in figure 5 here, on the x-axis we see the confidence required to stop evaluation. So basically at each layer we check our confidence, and if the confidence is higher than a certain threshold that is showed here, then we stop evaluation and we output our prediction. If not, then we just continue to the next layer. And interestingly, what we see here, so we have a confidence from 0.5 till 1. And of course, the more confidence we want, the blue line increases. So basically, we use then more layers. So if you want a confidence of 0.9, on average, we would need like 1.1 layers. If we want a confidence of almost 1, then we probably want to use all layers. And by the way, here the architecture that we used is basically just 3 layers with 128 neurons each at each layer. So basically, if we want to achieve the optimal confidence, then we would have to use all layers. And simultaneously, we see that the more confidence we want, the better our accuracy gets. So it gets until like almost 1, our accuracy. And the next results that also we got is basically we tried to find out how is the accuracy at each layer for each attack. So for this we used the multi-class classification problem. We computed the accuracy at each layer for each attack, and we got those 2 plots here. So basically we tried 2 architectures, one architecture with 5 layers, which is shown here in the x-axis, and the other architecture with 12 layers also. And here we have the attack families that are present in our UNSW 2015 dataset. So we have, as you can see here, normal traffic and many other attacks, like 9 attacks. And interestingly, what we see here is that the more layers we use, the better our accuracy gets. And of course, we see also that for some classes, only the first layer is already enough to get a really high accuracy. So if we go to the left subfigure here, we see, for instance, for a fuzzers, let's say, the accuracy starts really low and then increases over time. And it's similar for all other classes. So basically what we can conclude here is that not all layers are needed to get high accuracy, which is actually beneficial if we want to detect a mixture of easy to detect attacks and really complex attacks. So we design, first of all, a really deep architecture, but then we don't use all of it. Well, so from our results, we have some outcomes. So the first outcome is our architecture, which we call EagerNet. So basically eager stopping of evaluation. And we also propose the weighted backpropagation of losses. So basically we weight each loss and then we backpropagate many losses at the same time, and not only the loss from the last layer. And then for the conclusion, we conclude, as I showed you before, that deeper networks are not needed to detect or to classify all patterns, because some patterns are really easy to classify and some of them are more complex. We also found out that some network threats are easier to detect using FCNNs. So basically the EagerNet architecture will help us here save resources by evaluating only the layers that are needed. So for example, only 1, 2, or 3 layers instead of 12 layers. And this basically opens doors for a fast online evaluation. So if we want to implement our system and we want to get really fast feedback, then we don't have to evaluate all layers and basically introduce delay in the detection, but just evaluate as much as needed. Of course, the reference number 1 is our paper. The second reference is the features that we used in this work. And finally, also you can find our code in our repository. You can find also all pre-trained models, and you can reproduce basically our experiments. Thank you for listening.